Speaker.
Mr Speaker.
I call the Honourable Philip Goff.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, Labor's opposed to this bill. It's shoddy, it's rushed, it's inadequate in doing what it sets out to do, that is to provide protection against terrorists or international criminals. The officials told us that. And it's absolutely inadequate in terms of providing protection to ordinary New Zealanders going about their lawful business in terms of the ability of the state to intercept their communications without adequate scrutiny and without adequate safeguards. Mr Speaker, what this bill does is two things. First of all, it increases the power and the ability of the state to intercept private conversations between people over the telecommunications network. And it also expands the state powers to actually direct the telecommunications companies to do certain things or not to do certain things. But what really worries me about this is that this bill is the bill that's required to implement the changes made a couple of months ago in this chamber through the Government Communications and Security Bureau Act. That Act, which Jackie Dean seems to have overlooked, made a fundamental change in the power of the Government Communications Security Bureau. That Bureau wasn't previously lawfully able to spy on New Zealanders. As a result of this legislation, it now can do that. You know, it's funny, we had the GCSB bill in this House because the government was found to have abused its powers. It unlawfully spied on Kim.com. And when they set up an inquiry into that unlawful spying, Rebecca Kitteridge found that they'd done it in 88 other occasions. So you find that the Bureau has been abusing its power, and what is the government's answer to that abuse of power? It's to make the abuse of power lawful. It's not to stop the abuse of power, and that, sir, is an absolute nonsense. We live in an age when the state can exercise remarkable power over its citizens. And we're seeing that every day, Mr Speaker, through the revelations of Edward Snowden, who was the United States whistleblower. What has he exposed about the National Security Agency in the United States? He has exposed that they are intercepting and looking at not tens, not hundreds, not thousands, but millions of pieces of communication. Communication not by terrorists, not by international criminal gangs, not by those who are trying to break into the cyber security of other systems, but ordinary Americans and ordinary people around the world. They're even spying on their friends. They're spying on the Chancellor of Germany, an ally of the United States. And then we have the grovelling performance of the Minister of Defence, who goes over and meets the Secretary of Defence in the United States and says, "We trust you not to spy on us." And he gives him a rugby jersey. Wasn't that sweet? Wasn't that sweet? I would have asked the obvious question. There is an agreement under Five Eyes that said you don't spy on your allies. We want to know what they're doing. And I want to tell you this. Mr Coleman, Mr Smith, said we had no secrets. Well, apparently we do, because the government won't tell us what they're negotiating in the TPP, but they don't mind if the Americans are eavesdropping to find out what our negotiating position is. They don't mind. Apparently there's no secrets, but actually, Mr Smith, we have New Zealand companies competing with their American competitors, and I don't know whether you, Mr Smith, feel comfortable about the fact that they might be spying on what New Zealand companies are doing in this country, who are in competition with the Americans, but I'm not comfortable with that. And Dr Coleman should absolutely apologise for that fawning, grovelling interview that he did with Secretary of Defence Hagel. Mr Speaker, we can see that there is a real ability to abuse the powers in this bill, and that it happens both in New Zealand and around the world. We can see that there are inadequate protections because our Government Communications Security Bureau has unique powers that it can intrude on your secrecy or the secrecy of any New Zealander in this country. If we are going to give security agencies those sort of intrusive powers, then it's incumbent on this House to ensure that there are proper oversights so that we can be sure that those powers are not being abused. But, Mr. Speaker, when we had the government watchdogs and New Zealand watchdogs against the abuse of state power come before the committee, what did they tell us? They said that this bill should not proceed. They said that there is not adequate safeguards and that it is not satisfactory what the government is bringing before this House. Take the Law Society, for example. It says that there needs to be systemic checks that should be put in place to ensure that GCSB powers that are extended by the amendments are exercised appropriately. And what does the New Zealand Law Society say? It says those checks have not been put in place. They say this bill is intrusive. It empowers the GCSB to spy on New Zealand citizens and residents and to provide intelligence to government agencies in respect of those persons. It says it's inconsistent with the Bill of Rights. It says it's inconsistent with privacy interests recognised under law in New Zealand. That's the Law Society. And what does the Attorney-General say? What would the New Zealand Law Society know about the law and the Bill of Rights? It's their job. That is arrogance, Mr. Smith, and you know it. And then we have the Human Rights Commission. Now, Mr. Smith, the Human Rights Commission is appointed by this government. And what did they say? And I want to quote it to you, Mr. Smith. The Commission considers that what is proposed by the GCSB bill and the Telecommunications Interception bill is too wide-ranging. It does not provide adequate oversight. It makes inadequate provision for ensuring appropriate transparency and accountability of those who administer the legislation. It does not provide for a legal regime containing sufficient safeguards against abuse of power and to facilitate a proportional approach. And they say the primary recommendation of the government's own Human Rights Commission is that a full and independent inquiry into New Zealand's intelligence services be undertaken. This party's position. Now, what was the response of that government to its own Human Rights Commission saying this legislation shouldn't be before this House? The arrogant and overbearing response of that government was to threaten the funding of its own Human Rights Commission. Did they listen to the watchdog that they had set up that warned about this legislation? No, they threatened that watchdog and said, we'll withdraw your funding if you're critical of government. Mr. Speaker, frankly, that is an absolute disgrace, and the government should apologise for what it has done after it withdraws this legislation. And then we have the Privacy Commissioner. Now, the Privacy Commissioner is a woman that understands how our system works. She was for more than a decade the Secretary of our Cabinet. She knows the secrets of government. She is a practical and she's a wise person. But she said this legislation should not proceed in this form. This was not the right model of oversight to guarantee that we had protections against abuse. So I ask the next National Speaker who gets up to speak on this bill to say why each of those watchdogs are wrong in what they are saying, to say why adequate oversight has not been built into this legislation, to say why they are ignoring the overwhelming evidence of how these intelligence agencies quickly abuse their power, and in fact our own Government Communications and Security Bureau has abused its power. This legislation is not adequate. It is not in the right form. We were told it would not stop the serious terrorist groups because they know how to avoid those communication companies that are subject to interception. It won't work on them, but it will allow this government to spy improperly on New Zealanders going about their lawful business. New Zealanders are right to be concerned about this government. They are right to be concerned about its arrogance. They are right to be concerned about how out of touch it has got in 5 short years. We oppose this legislation, and we will, Dr Smith, change this legislation and change the Government Communications and Security Bureau Act that is so badly drafted and so lacks safeguards.
I call the honourable